Good evening from Glasgow. I'm Stefan Lechtenbrömer from Wuppertal Institute and Lund University, and I would like to say a very warm welcome to everybody here in the room in Glasgow and all our visitors in the live stream and the internet. Very good to have you here to the first side event on towards clean industrial value chains and how Europe can become front runner in the steel transition. So this evening we will talk about steel transition in the globe and in Europe particularly, and steel has been a very hot topic this COP, and we are happy to have very good experts on this theme here. But before I welcome our experts here, I would like to interact with our audience in the internet. So we are using Slido to interact with you. So you will be able to post comments and questions via the Slido tool, and the link will be given here or is already in the stream, as I can see. And just to test the instrument, I would really appreciate if you could type in from where you are listening and watching us tonight. So please type in your country or city as you like, and we can see that you are there and introduce you in our discussion. So very warm welcome to everybody to this side event. And now I would like to briefly introduce our speakers here in the room. We have Asa Ekdal, Director Environment and Climate Change World Steel Association. Nice to have you here. Hansian Wediger, Head of Climate Front Strategy Sustainable Production, ThyssenKrupp Steel Europe. Welcome, Hansian. And Corinna Zierold, Senior Policy Advisor, Industrial. And on top of that, we have in the internet Joachim Brown, Division President, Process Industries, ABB. And welcome on the internet, Joachim. I hope you can hear and see us and interact later with us. And Peter Handley, Head of Energy Intensive Industries and Raw Materials, DG GROW, also online. Hello to Brussels and hello to Mannheim. And now we will start our event with an introduction by Vito Vitka from Agora Industry. Vito, please.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. My name is Vito Vitka. I work for Agora Industry, a sub-brand of the Berlin-based think tank Agora Energiewende. Today I will be talking about why the global steel sector needs to invest in climate-neutral technologies in the 2020s. The global steel sector is at a crossroads. Before 2030, more than 70% of coal-based steelmaking capacity will reach the end of their operating life and require reinvestments. The reinvestment decisions for those plants will be crucial, whether they go into investing in climate-neutral technologies or whether they continue to invest in coal-based technologies. At the same time, in emerging economies, there's rapidly rising steel demand, especially in India and Southeast Asia, and those countries have a large project pipeline of coal-based steel-making capacity. As we will see in this presentation, the 2020s present a golden opportunity to invest in climate-neutral technologies, but they also present a high risk if the steel sector continues to invest in coal-based technologies. Due to the long lifetimes of steelmaking assets, the investment decisions in the 2020s will be crucial. For existing capacity, any reinvestment into a coal-based asset will lock in emissions for about 15 to 20 years from now on. For new coal-based steelmaking capacity in emerging economies, this can lock in emissions up to 50 years, as you can see on this slide. Now, as we are here at COP, the big question is, why should we treat unabated coal in the steel sector any different than coal in the power sector? And you're all aware of the announcements that we have heard in the past days here at COP. A couple of examples. The EU, as part of the Green Deal, plans to phase out coal power in the early 2030s. The US wants to have a carbon-free electricity system by 2035, and Korea just pledged to phase out coal power in the 2030s during this COP. If we look at reinvestments into coal-based assets in the steel sector, by this time, beyond this date, coal-based blast furnaces in those economies will be amongst the highest emitting assets. If we look to emerging economies, during this COP, we saw the announcement of Indonesia and Vietnam that they want to phase out coal power in the 2040s. However, at the same time, they have a large project pipeline of new coal-based steelmaking assets. And the big question is, will these investments become stranded in the future? If you look at this picture, here you can see that there's quite some risk in these investments. The good news is that low-carbon steelmaking technologies are ready for deployment, and the project pipeline is growing rapidly. Basically, it's about two technologies: direct reduced iron and a switch to scrap-based secondary steelmaking electric arc furnaces. What is also noteworthy is to understand which technologies are not in the project pipeline for low-carbon steel projects. No steel company worldwide is currently working on the commercialization of CCS on coal-based blast furnaces, and reinvesting in the 2020s into coal-based assets in steelmaking may be a dead-end road if the transformation or if the commercialization of CCS does not pick up in the future. If we look at the global picture, the asset transition in the 2020s is enormous. More than 1,000 million tons of coal-based assets will reach the end of its life and require reinvestment. And the challenge of the 2020s will be to close the transformation gap. This is what you see here in pink, as much as possible by investing into low-carbon steelmaking technologies. This will transform, or each such investment will transform jobs from coal-based jobs to clean, future-proof jobs in the steel industry. If we look at Europe, in the EU, many companies have announced to build low-carbon steelmaking plants, which could transition up to 90,000 workers to green jobs. In a sense, you could say the EU is a frontrunner in the global steel transition. However, to date, the regulatory framework for this low-carbon steel, a business case for this low-carbon steel, is still missing. And that is why, to my knowledge, we do not have any final investment decision to build these DRI plants in Europe. So the big challenge for EU decision makers and national governments is to create this regulatory framework within the next 1-2 years, that we can get the final investment decisions for those DRI plants, that they can be up and running by 2025. A final word on the demand side. The market demand for green steel is also developing rapidly. Car makers will be at the forefront of this, as it presents an opportunity to differentiate themselves from competitors. Over the past year, we have seen quite some cooperation agreements between steel companies and car makers that are willing to source low-carbon or green steel, and I believe this will soon become a global development. In conclusion, the global steel transformation needs to start in the 2020s. The key low-carbon technologies are ready to be deployed now. Aligning the steel sector with a 1.5 degrees compatible scenario needs to put the asset transition from coal to clean at its core. The best strategy from now on is to try to avoid reinvestments into coal-based assets by extending the lifetime of old blast furnaces that are due reinvestment by 2 to 3 years, and then to invest in DRI directly. By 2030, the global steel sector would require around 390 million tons of additional DRI capacity and up to 280 million tons of additional secondary steelmaking capacity. This is very ambitious, but we also believe that this is feasible, and it would save the atmosphere around 1.3 gigatons of CO2. For advanced economies such as the EU, this means that from now on, whenever a blast furnace reaches the end of its lifetime, it should be replaced with a technology that is compatible with climate neutrality. Last but not least, a single-speed global steel transformation, that is, a steel transformation that starts in all the regions simultaneously, will bring enhanced international cooperation and create a level playing field. The transformation will also help to transform millions of jobs from coal-based to clean and future-proof jobs. If you want to learn more about the global steel sector transformation, please check out our publications, Global Steel at the Crossroads. That was a joint paper with Wuppertal Institute and Lund University, and the Global Steel Transformation Tracker on the Agora Energiewende website. Thank you so much for your attention, and back to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Vito. Great. That was a very important presentation and very much enlightening. 70% of steel assets, over 1,000 million tons of steel, and same percentages in the European Union as well. So that's really a challenge. I'm really interested to hear from our speakers, from our experts here in the internet today, what they think about that, how they think we can achieve this important challenge. And I'm really happy, and I would like to start with you, Asa. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a flavor how that is for industry, and also maybe for countries which are not on the front today and have particularly high challenges, maybe Southern European, Eastern European countries who have important steel assets. That would be interesting to know.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's a pleasure to be here first. And it's really encouraging what we see in Europe now. Well, in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. So, as we heard, Europe is you could say, a front runner, not just in technologies, but also in how the industry, I mean, the whole sort of system around. But we see really important developments also in China, for example, in Brazil, in the US, and in the Middle East. And that's really encouraging. What I think we need to really think carefully about is why it's happening where it's happening right now. So there are a number of conditions that need to be met. And what we heard now is about technologies, which is really encouraging. Their technologies are reaching their, commercial scale or commercial phase. They haven't really got there yet, I would say. There are pilot and demonstration plants running around the world. But for them to really be implemented, there are lots of other things that need to be in place. And I'm thinking in particular about resources that you need for low carbon production. If we're talking about hydrogen-based DRI, hydrogen obviously is very, very important. But with that, if you want to produce it carbon-free, it also means renewable energy. It also means that the raw materials, the iron ore pellets that you put into a DRI furnace needs to be in place. And the situation around the world looks very different. These raw materials are in some places rather abundant, and in other places more scarce. So we need to really work with the supply chain, with the iron ore producers, for example, and the energy industry, but also with governments to really understand what the scale of the challenge, where we need to help the system, let's say, calibrate for the future. Because it is really a major shift, not just in terms of the production at the steel plant itself, but in the whole system. So that's of course, it's more challenging in countries where you don't really have a very good energy system, for example, at this time, or where there are not resources such as natural gas or storage or so. So I think I'll leave it at that now, but if there are questions, I'm happy to go into more detail, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you. Very important that you remind us of all the prerequisites that this strategy has. And of course, that can be a challenge for those regions who are not able to provide their industry for this challenge. With that, I would go to Hansian Wediger. Hansian, you are from ThyssenKrupp, so you are really doing these things, and I'm of course very interested to know how this bold plans and big challenges resonates with the plans of your company, and where do you see the chances, and what your customers are calling you.
I mean, thanks a lot for inviting us and to show basically how we get from a report to reality. And some of the things we just heard from Vito, we see in reality. Some of that we don't see yet. One thing that's very important is we don't see that switch all at once. It takes a time. Take our own company, ThyssenKrupp. We are currently operating 4 blast furnaces. We have announced that we will be replacing the first one in 25 by a DR plant and the second one before 2030, but we are not replacing all 4 at the same time. Why are we not doing that? There is a multitude of reasons for that, but some of that is what Åsa just mentioned. There is a lack of the required inputs. There is also certainly a lack of the engineering, because the DR plants worldwide at the moment, we have mainly 2 companies who provide them. So if they are suddenly to build nearly 400 million tons of DR plant capacity, that's going to be a challenge. And these are the things we are actually seeing will be putting a hindrance to the speed of transition. Certainly the technology is there yet in bits and pieces, but we are certainly have to really include it and integrate it in the plants, because we do, if you like, an open heart surgery. We do a transformation in an existing plant. We are not building a new plant next to it, but we just do it in the existing infrastructure, a very complex infrastructure of materials flows, energy flows. And we are already doing it, looking at some of the things also had hinted that what do you do with issues like you might not have enough DRI grade pellets, you might have an issue with certain qualities. So we really look at technical solutions where we find individual bits and pieces are there, but how to bring them together is still not been done. And that's, I think, what's very important. If we speak about technology, yes, we are still in the experimental phase a little bit, but certainly an experiment that needs to be done swiftly, because yes, we need to do that change, because steel will be, and I'm fully with you on that one, will be the largest single emission source after the coal-fired power stations have been switched off. We might have most probably a complete evening on whether that's a good or bad thing. The bad thing is it's very visible in terms of communication, political dispute, certainly very much a hotspot. The good thing is it's at one location. You can do much more about it than you have it disintegrated so much. So I'm not so sure that the single sources like you will have also in cement and chemistry and other industries are necessarily bad. But that's all about what you mentioned, the framework. And this is certainly what we are waiting for, to get the framework, to get the transition doing, because it will not be easy and it won't come cheap. You asked last thing, customers. This is what certainly our customers would prefer. Same qualities, plus green, and same price. And that's certainly something we can't deliver. However, it's something we will have to work on. How do we get a market in which, as we don't have that transition at the same time, both the products from the old route and from the new route have their place and have their, in one case, limited, in the other, hopefully glorious future ahead of them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, and very encouraging that you are really working at companies as ThyssenKrupp and others are really working on that operation on the open heart and with all their engineering capacities. Thanks a lot for that, and that's encouraging. I would now like to hand over to our first speaker from the internet, Joachim Brown, Division President, Process Industries, ABB. Hello, Joachim. I can now see you. Great that works. It's great to have you here as somebody who is not from steel industry, but due to your business, you are of course talking to steel industries, to their suppliers, to their customers. So you have a very good overview, and therefore I would really like to ask you. Given the market demand for steel is for green steel is very important, how do you see things emerging, and what are the driving forces from your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Stefan, and good evening to Glasgow. Yeah, from our point of view, and Vito already mentioned that the biggest driver in the beginning is clearly from the consumer side, the car industry, because that goes to end consumers, and it is also characterized by a large shift to battery-driven cars, which of course come with a different set of expectations when it comes to environmentally friendly transportation. So it is clear that people direct a lot of attention to the batteries, where right now the buildup of a European battery industry is in the making. And at the same time, this is also where we expect most of the demand for green steel to come from. In fact, some of the large car manufacturers like Toyota, Volkswagen, they have already announced that they would like to have a completely emission-free value chain, and obviously steel makes an important part in it. But I think it would go beyond that as well. I think there is an important prerequisite, and some of these prerequisites were already mentioned in what the EU is currently working on in terms of taxonomy, because the demand requires a certain orientation for consumers. It requires that I know what I'm buying, and so that taxonomy will be quite important to make such assessments and to drive demand. Right now, when we are buying steel for our own manufacturing, there's basically no real market for that. So we are also engaged with a couple of players in the industry in Sweden to build up such a system, at least initially, in the absence of an available system. But I hope that by and large this will be backed up by governments which are simply more credible than industry associations when it comes to such taxonomies. I guess another aspect is certainly investor interest. We should not forget that those companies which were the most valuable, let's say 20 years ago, which were primarily in the oil and gas and energy sector, they have lost a lot of their appeal to investors. And I think that will be an important driver as well, maybe not for direct demand, but if you look at the wider picture, and Hansian already mentioned that there will be quite a bit of funding required as well for this transition. Investors are certainly more and more looking into certain criteria where they put their money. And I guess that we are now a bit at the crossroads how the steel industry would position itself, because as we heard before, I think it has all what it takes in principle to become a forefront player in a carbon neutral society. Finally, I also believe that demand will be driven by first mover advantages. Again, we've seen this in the build of the battery industry in Europe. Right now, it's not so much of an issue that there's a demand. Right now, there's an issue of supply, and the same goes for green steel. So I think whoever will be first, and Vito showed some of these announcements, I think the interesting question is who can then really deliver. I'm convinced that there will be much more demand than supply initially, and the first movers will have a great advantage there. Not so much maybe in terms of pricing alone, but also in terms of positioning themselves as thought leaders in the industry.
Okay, yes. Thanks a lot for these deep insights and also widening our picture a bit. And I think that's very important. Thank you for that. And now I would like to hand over to Corinna. Corinna Zierold, Senior Policy Advisor, Industry All. And so you are representing the employees of the industry and other industries as well. And of course, this all is also about a lot of well-paid jobs in industrial regions, so very important. The good thing is, I think, that the steel transition offers new green jobs, so it's not about just scrapping jobs, but of course it's a challenge to convert those jobs, to have a just transition. But I even would be more interested today to hear from you the transition, we cannot take it for granted. And so how can the employees, the trade unions, join forces to make that happen?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. Indeed, Industrial, we represent the trade unions that are organizing the workers in the steel sector, but also in the sectors that are consuming steel. So also in automotive, in the energy sector, in machine building and other sectors. So when we talk about the steel sector in Europe, we are talking about I think approximately 330,000 jobs across the European Union in 500 sites and 22 member states. So it's quite an important number, but more important is also the indirect jobs and induced jobs. So altogether, we're talking about 2.5 million jobs approximately in Europe. And we are, of course, very concerned about the transition of those jobs and actually ensuring a just transition. As Industrial Europe, we know the challenges. It's a huge investment challenge, especially also in those regions that are maybe not as, do not have the same infrastructure, not the same conditions, also capacities in terms of government coffers to invest in new technologies. So this is really a concern for us, also the regional dimension. And we have asked, as Industrial Europe, for an ambitious action plan on EU level for the steel industry and for investments in good jobs in the steel industry in Europe and secure really and safeguard the steel sector, which is really also of a strategic and strategic importance in the European Union. So this is really important. Now our members on national level are doing the same, exactly the same. They are looking into the future and they are actively demanding and calling on companies, but also their countries, on launching strategies to greening the steel industry. We have our colleagues in FNW in the Netherlands, for instance, that actively demanded to invest in green steel in the Netherlands and to safeguard the 9,000 jobs that are connected to the business there in Tata Steel. We have also in Tata Steel our British colleagues from GMB, from Unite and Community that have done a study actually on the options of going greening the steel sector or the steel sites in the UK and safeguarding jobs there, and also looking into the long-term competitiveness of the sites. So this is really on our agenda. And we, of course, we are calling for a just transition for the workforce. What does it mean? Well, we demand anticipation of change and social dialogue with the unions, workers' participation, information and consultation with workers. So it's really, we are not the passive recipients of policies or strategies. We are actors in this transition, and we deliver the work, basically. We have to carry out the jobs. So we want to have a seat at the table. We want to be in social dialogue at all levels, be it on the national level, be it sectoral level, company level. Yeah, so I leave it here, maybe for the introduction. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Corinna, and very good that the trade unions are actively pushing for that. I think that's very important that we have a strong societal drive behind this transition. And now I would like to hand over to our last speaker, Peter Handley from Head of Energy Intensive Industries, Raw Materials at DG Grow. Hi, Peter. I think I do not really need to pose a question because there came already a number of things up, and so it's all on the Commission now. So what do you think, or what are your plans or your takes? How do you take up this momentum that is already there with the companies, with the trade unions, to really come to Europe as a front runner for green steel?
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with the generally positive vibe coming out of this event. I think Europe is well positioned to be a front runner in transforming its steel industry. We came out in May as part of the updated industrial strategy with a document assessing the prospects for the steel sector. So that went into the kind of like the technology pathways and what's needed in terms of policy, trade defense, investment, and jobs and skills and transformation of carbon intensive regions. So we've basically got a very good understanding of what needs to be done. And we've just, in fact, launched a process to develop a transition pathway for the energy intensive industries as a whole, and we're hoping very much to co-create this transition pathway with the steel sector, as Corinna has said, with the unions as well, with member states and civil society. It's very important to work out how you get from where you are today to where you want to be by 2030. And as the gentleman from ThyssenKrupp has said, you can't do everything in one fell swoop. You have to actually manage the process of change, because you're not dealing with a greenfield site most of the time. It's about thinking about how the supply chain, the value chain, and all the processes are going to be different in the future. So it's best to do it in a large-scale demonstrator first before doing everything. And that's where I think some of our tools can be quite useful, like the Innovation Fund. The large-scale call has just gone out now. We're expecting quite a lot of steel-related projects to be successful. My unit's actually not only dealing with raw materials and energy intensives, also dealing with the Hydrogen Alliance. So we've seen there's a huge appetite for public-private partnerships for the first industrial applications of clean hydrogen in the steel sector. So there's a whole bunch of things coming together. I think I should, however, say that we're not going to get to the ideal future unless we really get a grip on global overcapacity. As we heard from the first speaker, there's a lot of new capacity being built, which is still coal-based. And of course, it's every country's sovereign right to build new steel capacity if it wishes. But if they want to sell that product to the European market, then they must expect to have to face our carbon border adjustment mechanism, because we have a carbon price in Europe, which our industries have to live with. And it's only fair that anyone who wants to sell their product on our market has to take account of that in the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that's going to be hopefully something that might incentivize some of the third countries to think twice before they invest in new coal-based steel capacity. I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for all the policy developments that you have already kick-started. Maybe allow me one follow-up question, because that's now up in the media. The EU and the US have made a sort of a agreement or announced they want to work on jointly on steel. So can you already give us some details on what you are planning there together with the US? Because it's, of course, important to go global in the end best.
Yeah, well, the most obvious consequence is it's like a peace clause. So the Section 232 tariffs that the US had imposed on the European industry will not be totally withdrawn, but they will be relaxed to the level of historic trade. So that's the first thing, and that allows us to unblock a number of things that were causing tension in the EU-US relationship, and allow us to think about a constructive agenda, which we will be opening up to any other country that wishes to take part. So we're looking at how we can give a fresh impetus to addressing global overcapacity in both the steel and the aluminium sectors, where it's driven by non-market forces in some cases, so dumping, subsidies, things like that. Secondly, it also has a positive agenda around standards for green steel, about the power of public purchasing to be the first mover in creating a market for these green products. And there may be other areas as well where we can collaborate on the new technologies. And this will also play into our bilateral relationship in the new EU-US Trade and Technology Council. This whole decarbonization of industry is going to be an important part of our bilateral conversation.
Okay, thank you. So we keep our fingers crossed that it really works out, and we are here at the COP. So many other states are there, important states who have to join in, and that's a good site to announce that. So having heard all these important inputs from our speakers, I would like to open now up to our audience, and maybe I look over to Vito. Is there any questions or remarks from the internet?
So far, I don't see any questions in the internet. So in this case, either I give it back to you, Stefan, for further questions, or I can pose a question.
Please start with your question, and then we will try to go into the conversation. And of course, everybody in the internet, please feel free to ask questions.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Wediger, I think it is a widespread misbelief that the steel sector needs to wait for sufficient amounts of clean hydrogen to start the transition. And you mentioned before that ThyssenKrupp is planning to build the first commercial scale DRI plant by 2025. So the question is, will you have sufficient amounts of clean hydrogen available by then? And what could be strategies if this is not the case?
I mean, first of all, just to clarify, it's not the first commercial one, it's our first commercial one. Because DRI technology is not new. You mentioned you want to have roughly 400 million tons of added capacity. That's added to around 100 million tons we see today. So it's in itself a known technology. However, and this is what you're rightfully hinting at, the idea is how can we actually switch that from natural gas in the medium to long run to hydrogen. And it's not that we will be starting with 100% of hydrogen. We will be, or we have to, I must say, wait for enough hydrogen to be there. We can, within reason, switch between the two gases, and we are fortunate, at least at our location, that we have a sufficient gas provision on site. However, this is definitely not the case for every single site we see in the world. So some might really struggle with having any gas available, leave alone hydrogen. And certainly this comes very much to the question we see. The speed of transformation will be determined by the speed of renewable energies coming in, because it's a simple chain. If you want to speak about green steel, I mean, we could speak about the definition for another evening as well, but green steel requires green hydrogen requires green electricity. That's at least our thinking at the moment. And hence, it's a question of the provision of electricity plus the infrastructure in between, the infrastructure for electricity, the infrastructure for hydrogen, and so on and so forth. But it's not that we start with hydrogen because there will be not enough available. We see a shortage not only in hydrogen and in electricity, we see a shortage, as also mentioned, in the raw materials for that. We see a shortage in the engineering capacity to actually turn that around. So this is what we are fighting against, the shortages. And the one, which also rightfully was mentioned, is certainly a shortage of money, or at least of capital available, because what we are investing here is not just a little bit of a relining. It's really huge amounts of money that's needed as an investment into a climate-friendly future. Because, and I would like to go back to your chart on the contributions in the car industry. Steel has a very strong contribution. This is because you have a lot of steel in the car. And this is not just because they didn't have any idea what to do, because for many applications steel is and will be the material of choice. The whole thing you mentioned about electrification. Electrification basically relies on I take some motion into electricity, wind power, in order to do that and to later then turn the electricity into motion again, the motor, I need an effect that's called ferromagnetism. Ferro from iron, because it only works with iron materials, hence with steel. So this is one of many applications where we are sure the solution, which you haven't been proposing, is not there to say just we drop steel and the problem is solved. Since we need steel, even more steel, because the rest of the world, Stefan, you want to join that US-EU alliance, certainly is a world that's growing, that needs more living standard, will need more materials, and hence we have an increased challenge to really provide that in a climate-friendly way, so that it's not either wealth and well-being or climate change, but all three of them at the same time.
Yes, thank you that you remind us of that and of all the challenges. I would like to ask Joachim Brown. There have been all these investment challenges mentioned, and you are also you are not building steel makers, but you are part of these investments, of course, and you are building factories. How do you see that? Will it be possible to ramp up capacities to really, if we get the funds, to really go for this transition?
Yes, I would very strongly believe so. I think the power is really in the collaboration. Hans-Johann had been pointing at a couple of issues here. What I would really like to encourage the industry to do is to proactively collaborate. If you look at where the first steel, CO2 neutral steel in Europe was produced in a pilot plant in Sweden, it came basically through a collaboration with a mining company, with a steel maker, and with a utility company. And these are already some of the key factors we just heard about. You need to have the pellets for this. Of course, then you need a steel maker who understands that art. And then you need to have the green power, and then preferably also basically built into hydrogen. So just bringing those three players together into a joint project, and I think it's not by coincidence, has already led, again, on a pilot level, not on a commercial level, to the first production of green steel, which was publicized quite heavily back in June. We see more of those initiatives, and interestingly enough, lots of that happening in the Nordic countries. Along the value chain, you see similar initiatives in mining, for example, where leading players of equipment, really the heavy stuff, but then companies like ABB, who are more into automation, digital electrification, all the way up to pure software companies, formed an alliance for sustainable underground mining, because again, we basically want to render the whole supply chain CO2 neutral. So out of this collaboration, I think some of these issues, which Hans-Johann rightfully mentioned, could be overcome. And rather than waiting for anyone to make the first step, I think that those collaborations can already go a long way, and they can create a dynamic and a momentum which might then also impress the policymakers. It might impress other players in the market, consumers, the demand side, the supply side, and so on. I think, and it's interesting that you mentioned these different transmission mechanisms, Hans-Johann, because as a producer of electric motors, ABB is of course also part of it. So I think this mutuality, this closed loop supply chain really makes a lot of sense here, because to the extent that our customers are facing these demands, they will of course put it on us as well. So we might as well help mining iron ore, producing CO2 neutral steel, and then basically furnish also electrical motors, which are then also produced in a CO2 neutral way. So this is why I really believe that this collaboration can already go a long way. And that, of course, doesn't take away the pressure on the policymakers to put the prerequisites in place. But I think we heard a lot of good things already. We're talking about global regional carbon pricing implementations. We're talking about creating a level playing field. We're talking about, of course, making sure that green energy and hydrogen is available in different sites. Of course, you could also think about importing some of that, both the energy and or the hydrogen. And let's not forget about the mining sector as well, because this is typically quite a lengthy process. And if you want to ramp up some of that, because that might then become the next scarce thing, we might also want to basically take a fresh look at the deposits we have in Europe, for example, where we're opening up some interesting mining activities there as well, and beyond.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for reminding us in the importance of cooperation. And I would like to ask Corinna on that. You are also responsible, for example, for energy industries. Industrial has even consumers. You mentioned that. So do you think there's ways to come to new cooperation that will really give a boost to this development?
Cooperation in terms of?
Yeah, new cooperations between companies and trade unions. You are across sectors, so maybe you could facilitate something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we are involved, engaged at European level at least, as Peter also mentioned. We are engaged in the high-level group for the energy-intensive industries, also in the industrial forum, which is actually looking into the implementation of the industrial strategy, the updated one from the European Commission that was presented a year ago. And I mean, this is also looking into the global picture. It looks. When I think about the master plan that we've been talking about in 2019 and designing together in the high-level group for the energy-intensive industries, also not only with the steel sector and representatives from other energy-intensive industries, but also with the energy providers that were also represented in the working groups, Eurogas and Eurelectric. We are doing that, and we have active social dialogue in all the sectors. And we are also at the moment actively involved in the co-creation process of the transition pathways. So we are, indeed, we are looking into the global picture, bringing the different sectors together. Yeah, for us, I mean, it's a global demand, which is certainly valid for all the sectors, that we want to be involved, that we want to engage in social dialogue, and that we basically want to be engaged in order to ensure that there is a smooth transition for every employee, that there are pathways for every employee, and that there are actually decent quality jobs at the end of the process.
Yeah, of course, that's important. Hans-Jörn, I stopped you, and maybe you could also briefly hint on the things that Infor-Climate, one of the co-organizers, really doing to bring together maybe steel industry and energy industries. And
I mean, one thing to say is cooperation is not something that suddenly comes up with climate change. It's never that we made steel for the sake of making steel, and it's never that we made it sort of alone as a company, whatever a company might be. So cooperation with the workers, cooperation with the customers, with the supplier, is something we have been doing for hundreds of years. Maybe some of the players change because some of the goals and some of that changes. Maybe the cooperation changes. And the interesting thing, that's a very personal view I see in this climate field, is we have over the last 5 years, I would say, very much come from a rather confrontational approach to really, yes, we need to do that together approach. And this, I think, has helped a lot. It hasn't removed all the roadblocks, but it has removed many. And I think that's the reason why we see the speed. And also when I'm hinted at the problems, the reason we look at the problems is not to say, okay, yes, sorry, there's a problem, I can't do anything, I hide behind it and I wait for something else to happen, but to see what we can do about it. Let me just take one of them, the likely shortage of this high-quality DRI pellets. That's the reason why we at ThyssenKrupp have said we are going a slightly different route. We're going a route that explicitly allows us to use more traditional ores in the future as well, in order to be able to remain in a slag metallurgy and really to do something so that we are not burdened by the fact that there is very little DRI pellets around, but that we can really expand that. And it's interesting to see that some of our competitors are now following that road. And this is something which we very much welcome, because at the end of the day, as you said, it's about working together, about sharing ideas and about getting them in the way. But, and this is one important point I would like to make on the study, there is no silver bullet. There is not that one technology, the one approach that fits for all. I mean, we have thousands of steel grades, numerous ways of shapes and forms and applications, and not without reason we have 3 major production routes at the moment. We will have different production routes, different installations at different locations, and that's not a bad sign, it's a good sign, because at the end of the day it's customer focused. What do you need and how can we deliver it?
Yeah, thank you, and also for innovating already, and that shows how important it is to start. And maybe Asa, do you have some good examples also to tell us to learn from?
Yeah, I mean, first to to echo what we've heard. I mean, collaboration throughout the supply chain with other actors is really important, with governments as well, absolutely. And we see a number of technologies as well. Still, we think absolutely we need a suite of technologies to be implemented, as it fits with the local circumstances. And some examples that I can think of right now, for example, one of our members in Brazil is now have a carbon-free production with the blast furnace. It's a relatively small one. I believe they produce 1.8 million tons, but it's completely based on sustainable biomass, a charcoal-based blast furnace, and this is an excellent solution for their case. But it's not. It's obvious that it's not going to could be implemented everywhere. Biomass is a very scarce resource, but in this particular location, it works perfectly. We also have a member in the United Arab Emirates, Emirates Steel. They have a DRI plant that is based on natural gas, which is of course abundant in that region. They are now collecting their CO2 and they are sequestering it, which means that this is a commercial site. DRI plants tend to be a bit smaller than your integrated sites. I believe they are sequestering about 800,000 tons of CO2 per year. But it's also an excellent solution, which is really implemented, which is quite local. You would see those solutions where you have abundant natural gas, and of course old gas fields where you can do the storage. I believe that would be quite an important technology in the Middle East, perhaps in the south of the US and in some other regions as well. And then, of course, with the hydrogen-based DRI, but also you can see a combination of all of these different technologies. That there's a possibility to inject a certain amount of hydrogen into an existing blast furnace. You could also feed it with partially bio-based carbon. Instead of injecting pulverized coal, you could inject coal powder made from biomass, for example. You could use the gases to produce CCU products, so ethanol, for example, that could be used in the plastics industry. And you can also, of course, sequester the CO2 that you're using, which is a combination of many of these technologies together. And I think, exactly like Hans-Jörn said, I think we will see many of these how can I say, these big sort of technology approaches being adapted slightly to the specific needs of the region. I must just say, at the end, it's a very exciting time that we find ourselves in. As we see, there's lots more attention to the steel industry, which we haven't really seen before. There's also a lot of response from the company, from the industry. We also see a number of important initiatives from all kinds of organizations. I'm sure you heard earlier this week about the Glasgow breakthrough and the steel breakthrough that is now being launched by the UK presidency. And under that, you have a number of initiatives around public procurement, around mission innovation, on scaling up the demonstration plants and so on. So it's lots of things going on, which is really very exciting.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really very important, and that you highlight that of course we will never have one solution. We will have a mix of solutions, and innovation is coming about when things come up. I would like to have a question, last question to Peter. There's again a lot of things popped up here, but we heard, of course, when we want to get big and carbon neutral, we need lots of investment. And I know Germany, for example, discusses carbon contracts for difference. But what does the European Union do to speed that up? Because in the end, after the innovation funds, big investment will be needed, and not every country is able to really put that investment. Look to other countries we have discussed today. So is there anything the Commission can do about that?
Well, we've got a whole variety of funds. We're doing a whole load of things through Horizon Europe with the Clean Steel Partnership, which will get us, up to kind of TRL level 8, and then we've got the Innovation Fund, which picks on from there, and then InvestEU, where we'll be working closely with the European Investment Bank to take us into the manufacturing and production phase, and bringing in leverage to bring in the private sector investors alongside them. So there's a lot can be done there, and on the carbon contracts for difference to, if you like, make it easier to access the market when your product may perform the same as a classic product, but the processes you've used are much cleaner. There you've got two pathways. You've got, through the Energy and Environment State Aid Guidelines, the possibility for national carbon contract for difference schemes, like you already have one in the Netherlands. But the new element through the Fit for 55 package is that carbon contracts for difference will now be possible through the Innovation Fund. So the best schemes will have to compete for access to European level funding to help them in that respect. Just one thing I would like to add is, let's not forget Africa. We're talking very much about a sort of Eurocentric type position here. We've touched on Asia, we've touched on Latin America, but Africa is going to be a fast-growing region of the world. And I think it's in everyone's interest to help the African continent develop the clean steel path rather than going through the dirty steel path first. And there are some interesting things going on there, like in Uganda, for example, there's a very interesting project to produce steel using hydrogen coming from hydropower. So let's try and think about how we can help the whole world make this a clean steel transition.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for reminding us that that's also other nations, and I fully agree. It could be also an option for them to really leapfrog, and maybe some countries like South Africa can find even a business case in producing green iron and exporting parts of that also to Europe. So thanks a lot, Peter, for bringing that. And with that, we are already at the end of our session here, unfortunately. And I thank all you here, Peter and Joachim in the internet, for these really very great contributions and for the good discussions. I also thank all the guests here in the room. It's really a pity that you couldn't ask questions, but that's not allowed due to COVID. But we are available afterwards, so you can post them directly to us, and we are happy to discuss with you afterwards outside the pavilion. And many thanks to also to our visitors in the internet and all the others who made this technically available. There in the back is a whole crew. Thank you for making that. And thanks a lot, and have a good evening, and all the best. Stay healthy, and all the best for the COP to really deliver on what we all want to save the climate. Thanks a lot.